they said, when we were out in the hall, she said, they're already counting it down. It's 175 days till summer. But it is good to have folks sort of back from the summer hiatus, the summer break, and to step right back in to what we've been talking about now for several weeks, this profound image of Jesus as the bread of life. Now, who was here last week? A good number of you. Do you remember where we started last week? World War I. Who said, way to go, Jack, man. World War I. Oh, sorry. Sorry, Matthew. Jack's on the other side. Well done, young man. So, last week we started with World War I, so it's fitting that this week we will start with World War II. Fits perfectly with the gospel, right? Does anybody have an idea of what this might be? It's a New Testament. It's a New Testament. It's a particular kind of New Testament. In fact, if you open it, if I'm very careful, you'll see that the first couple of pages, one has an American flag, and the other is a letter from Franklin D. Roosevelt, Commander-in-Chief. To the Armed Forces, as Commander-in-Chief, I take pleasure in commending the reading of the Bible to all who serve in the Armed Forces of the United States. Throughout the centuries, men of many faiths and diverse origins have found in the sacred book words of wisdom, counsel, and inspiration. It is a fountain of strength, and now as always, an aid in attaining the highest aspirations of the human soul. One of the interesting things about this, along with the Lord's Prayer and a number of hymns, it includes a tiny list where to find help. Where to find help at particular times when you're facing particular circumstances. And it begins where to find help when you are afraid. The very first thing, when you are afraid. And it has a long list of New Testament scriptures to refer to when you are in the grips of fear itself, a very appropriate thing for someone to take into battle. This is a New Testament from World War II. Now we'll get back to that in just a moment. What I'd now like to do is talk about Jerusalem. Seems a little bit closer to the gospel reading, doesn't it? World War II, now Jerusalem. So Jerusalem, if you were to go to Jerusalem today and look across the skyline, you would notice, of course, immediately a great golden dome in the distance on what should be, without the existence of high-rise buildings, the highest point in the city. That golden dome sits atop something called El Haram al-Sharif, the noble sanctuary. It is the mosque that is sacred, second only to Mecca, for the Muslim faith. It's a place of also great controversy because it sits upon something else. Now, if you were to go inside the mosque, you would see a great stone. And according to Islamic tradition, that is the stone from which Muhammad would ascend to heaven. But in order to build that mosque in the year 691, they had to tear down something that was already there. What they had to tear down was a Christian church built by Constantine in the year 325. But of course, for Constantine to have built that church in 325, he had to tear down something that had been built in the year 135. He had to tear down the temple of Jupiter built by Emperor Hadrian. And actually, in order for Hadrian to have been able to build the temple of Jupiter on that site in the year 135, he had to clear away the rubble, the remains, the last few stones that were left standing of the great temple built by Herod. The temple that Jesus would have walked in and the temple that Jesus would have known. It had been burned, destroyed by the Romans in the year 70. Now, of course, before that, the temple had been on that site. But for about 500 years before Herod started his massive rebuilding, it had been sort of a shadow of its greatness. Because before it had been destroyed by the Romans, it had been destroyed by the Babylonians. The year 586, Nebuchadnezzar comes into Jerusalem, takes the city, and he razes the temple. A little bit later, about actually 70 years later, he allowed it to begin being rebuilt by a man named Zerubbabel. There's going to be a test, by the way, on all these names and dates later on. And while he did rebuild it, it was just a shadow of its former self. The temple that the Babylonians had destroyed in 586 is actually the temple that you read about this morning in the Old Testament lesson, the Temple of Solomon. We have about 11 or 12 verses there describing this moment, really, the dedication of the temple. It had taken him years and years to build it. But in about the year 985 before Christ, so about 1,000 years before Christ, the temple had been built and the temple had been dedicated. It had been placed on that spot because that same stone that our Muslim brothers and sisters hold very sacred was the stone that, according to tradition, Abraham had offered up Isaac on that stone there on Mount Zion. So there was a tremendous amount of history in that place. Now, before this, what had the Israelites done for worship? Well, they had the Ark of the Covenant. And for 480 years, remember, I'm testing you on the dates, the numbers, you need to write this down. For 480 years, since they had fled Egypt, the Israelites had carried the ark with them throughout the wilderness, into the land of Canaan, even into battle against the Philistines. It was the presence of God. And now that presence of God would be taken and it would be placed inside the sanctuary, the most sacred place in the temple. Without a doubt, a good, faithful Jew could look to Jerusalem and know that there resides the presence of God. They had known that with the ark. Now they knew it with the temple. You might be in Bethlehem. You might be in Jericho. You might be up in Tyre. But you knew that the presence of God was in Jerusalem in that holy place. And Solomon had built this grand, ornate temple to house that presence. Now, truthfully, that's not a new idea. Every religion, every faith has this idea that they will build a house for God. There is something about the human heart, the human soul, the human psyche that demands this place of reverence. And that brings us to the gospel this morning. You see, one of the things that we do when we build a church or a temple or a synagogue is that we proclaim that the presence of God is there. What we do not do is proclaim that the presence of God is not elsewhere, but too often that's the way it gets interpreted. Oh, maybe not consciously, but sort of subconsciously. I can behave one way here, I can be this person there, but once I am at church, once I am in the temple, once I'm in the synagogue, I'm in the presence of God, and so therefore I am somehow a different person. It's just possible that some of us act one way when we're here and another way when we're not here. I see a few nods. I'm willing to bet Oh, only about 99% of us should be nodding. It's just possible that Father Rob was acting a little bit different yesterday on the tractor over in Cherokee County than I am right now. But more than anything, one of the great dangers that we face is when we assume that God is confined to what we have built, that we don't acknowledge the presence of God in all places and in all people. And that is what Jesus is talking about in the gospel this morning. Jesus says very clearly, I am the living bread that came down from heaven. Now remember, we're in a whole series of readings. I am the living bread that came down from heaven. And then, those who eat my flesh and drink my blood abide in me, and I in them. For weeks now, we have had this great statement about the living bread and the fact that Christ has come among us. But what indeed does that mean, and how does it challenge us? Well, it challenges us in very, very specific ways. D-Day, Normandy. There is an American chaplain who is offshore the night before. And he is walking among his men, praying with them and talking to them and handing out these. He talks to them about faith. And he talks to them about fear. And he talks to them about the presence of God. And as a reminder of that presence, he gives them one of these. Most of them take it and open their blouse and put it in the pocket here against their heart. And it rides into battle with them the next morning. The chaplain went ashore with the second wave. As he waded ashore, he saw the bodies of the men who had not made it. And he saw these New Testaments floating in the waves. Lieutenant Colonel George Barber was his name. Under intense fire, he went among the dying, praying with them, holding their hands and being present in that moment, letting them know that they were not alone. This particular New Testament was given to my father. This was his. From New Guinea to the Philippines to the islands that he hopped heading up toward Japan. This was in his pocket beneath his flight jacket when he and his squadron flew over Hiroshima at the end of the war. To look down, to see the devastation of that destroyed place. Lots of American planes went up just to see, just to look down and see what death would look like in the century to come. And this rode with him. I asked my dad, I said, Dad, doesn't look like you read it much. He said that he hadn't. That he actually had the Bible that his mother had sent with him. Rosalie Ashmore. And that's what he would read in the night. But this was something else. This was a reminder. It was a reminder that went with him everywhere. It was a reminder placed against his heart. A reminder that he was not alone. Lieutenant Colonel Barber talks about that night at Omaha Beach. that first night ashore. And what he says is this: I couldn't get over the 100-foot cliff that separated us from going inland. So I had to dig my own foxhole right on the beach. I prayed as I dug, as if everything depended on the Lord, and I dug as if everything depended on me. He says the Lord and me got that foxhole pretty deep. Unable to sleep, Barbara crouched in this foxhole, in this shelter, throughout the storm of battle that night. He said, I watched the sky lit up by tracer bullets. Every fifth bullet is a tracer, so you can see it go up and you can see it come down. And in that place, in that moment, he knew with certainty that God was present. He knew with certainty that a hand-dug trench is as holy as any cathedral, because of what Jesus reminds us today, because of what my Father knew all those years ago. Whoever abides in me, I will abide in them. The only place where you can find God without limit, without boundaries, without borders, is the human heart. Amen.